thank you for coming. It's a big pleasure for us to welcome again Professor Haun Saussy for his second speech on the 9 relays. Unfortunately, today we have a competing activity at Wukong, the National Palace Museum. But anyway, I think that everybody will be able to catch up thanks to the recording that we are doing. And after some speech, Professor CHANG from the History and Philology Department of the Institute of the Academia Sinica will do a discussion for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open the discussion. Thank you again.
All right, thank you, Hector. Yeah, I can't really compete with the National Palace Museum. You know, that is an incomparable place, a magnificent collection, and you know, I don't blame anyone for being down there to hear all about landscape. All right, so today we're talking about the question of whether the barbarians can sing or whether they can 作乐. So here goes. However we define China, and there are many answers to that question on offer these days in bookstores, journals, and on the political stage, it has always been multicultural. That is, it has emerged from the contact of different ways of life maintained by groups that thought of themselves as different from each other. It has been multilingual too, however you define that, and its inhabitants have situated themselves in different histories despite ceaseless efforts at centralization. That is obvious to us, but it was a problem for the classical scholars of the early Han court. The collected discussions in the White Tiger Hall, the Baihu Tongyi, compiled after 79 AD, include a discussion of the virtues of music, framed, as in the writings of Xunzi and the Li Ji, as a counterpart to ritual. Let me see if I can get my next slide. Yeah. Ritual distinguishes, but music brings together. Right? Xunzi says, 乐和同 Li Bie Yi. Right? So they're similar but complementary. Ritual establishes hierarchies, but music creates feelings of commonality. Ritual without music becomes dry and sterile. Music without ritual becomes a chaotic indulgence. Right? You find all that in Xunzi, and the Li Ji borrows very heavily from Xunzi. Thus, through the logic of serial redefinition and repeated parallelism characteristic of warring states and Han systematizing thought, music is established among the institutions that realize the ideal community envisioned by the long ago sages. On that understanding of the purposes of music, however, a problem crops up in the classics. The rituals of Zhou, the Zhou-Li, for example, state that music of the 4 alien tribes is performed during court ceremonies. When I'm using the word yi in Chinese, I'm translating it provisionally by the term alien, in preference to the overloaded word barbarian. At times, I'll just use yi. So the wording is, 低楼是掌四夷之乐，予其笙歌，既在这吹而歌之，焉亦如之. Right? The Dilo takes charge of the 4 alien tribes' music and accompanies it with sung words. At the sacrifice, he is to blow and sing it, and at banquets likewise. Well, Dilo sounds like an exotic word, and the leather radical on the left side of both characters connotes something rough and outdoorsy. Right? Sounds a bit like the kind of thing that you'd find in the vocabulary used to describe the wrong in the Di. Was there an official specially dedicated to perpetuating the art of foreign music in the ideal realm of the founding Zhou? In response to such passages highlighting barbarian music, the Baihutong authors cite the Yue Yuan Yu, or authoritative discourses on music, a lost work, current though in the Han, to correct the earlier classic. 所以作四夷之乐和，得广己之也。得广己之也。乐源于乐，受命而六乐，乐先王之乐，民有法也。于其所制作，民有志。 兴四夷之乐，明德广集之也. Right? What is the reason for having the music of the 4 alien tribes performed? Let me click down to the next one. Yep. It is to show that the royal virtue had spread even to them. The Yueyueyu says, a ruler who has received the mandate causes 6 kinds of music to be performed. The music of the former kings is performed to show his legitimacy. Right? Then he has music from his own reign performed in order to display his instituting power. Thereafter, he has music of the 4 Yi performed in order to show that his virtue extends even to them. Right? So that's the Bai Hu Tong explaining away why there is barbaric music in the royal court. And there are some further specifications about the differences among these sorts of music, which we won't go into in all of the gory detail, right? There's classification by a direction, and you get the names of the different kinds of music and so on. The important lines are these. The musicians perform celebratory music in the hall. The music of the 4 aliens is kept outside and to the right. The sovereign has received music from the former kings, and in a sign of perpetuating the mandate, causes it to be begun again, right? So the king is always restoring and renewing the music of the former kings. And so the discussion goes on with more description of the music and dance and so forth, ending with the question, who made the music for the Yi and Di tribes? And the answer comes, it is the doing of the former sage kings. The former kings practiced the way and virtue and harmonized yin and yang. This came to cover even the Yi and Di. Thereupon the Yi and Di, being joyful and at peace, came to pay homage in the central states, and the kings made music to gladden them. Right? So all of that is the Bai Hu Tong trying to explain the problem of barbarian music. Now, as Yu Shaohua has observed, the elaboration on the regional types of music serves to arrange the barbaric states in a symmetrical pattern centered on the Zhou king, a kind of mandala and calendar wherein the foreign tribes each have a moment, but the whole year remains the property of the center. They revolve around the central monarch as elements of a conceptual Mingtang. Right? And you can see here you've got the northern Di, you've got the eastern Yi, you've got the southern Man, you've got the western Rong, and each of them has their own kind of music, and they're arranged very tidily around the king who sits in the center, and each type of music is made to correspond with a season, so it's as if, you know, we're sort of living out a calendrical pattern here. Thank you, that makes it clearer. Moreover, in a clinching move on the part of the Bai Hu Tong authors, the Yi and Di may have music, but it isn't really theirs. They have it as a gift from the people who invented culture, namely Yao Shun, Yu, Zhougong, and the other heroes of the central states in the empire. The reason has to do ultimately with the capacities of the different populations. So the text says that the Yi and Di are zhi, which I hear translate as crude, right? Yi Di zhi, bu ru Zhongguo wen, right? The Yi and Di are crude. They lack the refinement of the central states. Dan sui wu ming zhi er. So they give names to things randomly, you know, not in accordance with the principle of zhengming, of the correctness of names. And not even 100 kings could change them, right? When the kings made Yi and Di music, did they not also make Yi and Di rituals, asks someone. And the answer comes no, because rituals are a precedent to be followed with one's person, and the Yi and Di people are incapable of performing a ritual. Music, on the other hand, is something that the sages made to give them pleasure. And as a result, there is Yi and Di music, just there's no corresponding ritual. And who performs the dance, it is asked. It must be performed by people of the central states. Why so? The Yi and Di are incapable of ritual, and it is to be feared that were they to attempt to participate in court ritual, there would be flaws and misunderstandings. Right? Yi Di zhi ren li bu bei, kong you guo wu ye. Why do they make music from outside the gate of the palace? The answer comes, the Yi are outside. That is their destination. Being people without understanding of ritual, the Yi and Di must remain outside the gate. All right. So I interpret that this passage as meaning that ritual inferiority is the condition on which some bits of Yi and Di culture are allowed to approach the palace, that central showplace, not as an equal or competitive culture, but as an incomplete and unmeaning outward show, good enough for foreigners, but never the real thing. And at least in this Han Dynasty interpretation, it's kept on the threshold, not brought in. A commentary to the Zhou elaborates on this point and says, 礼者所以君中国也，即为以礼，恐一人不能随中国礼也。故春秋与以礼不备则，诸夏有及以礼者，即以之也。Right? The rites are used. Let me see, do I have a slide for this? Yes. The rites are used to regulate the central states. Supposing there were Yi rituals, it is likely that Yi people would be incapable of following the rituals of the central states. That is why the Chunqiu never blames the Yi and Di for their conduct. If people of Xia descent were to perform barbarian rituals, that would barbarize them. We'll come back to this passage later, but I just want to underline the point about the Chunqiu recording lots and lots of invasions and treaty breakings and all kinds of behavior that would be considered bad if it were conducted among people of the central states. But if it's done on the part of the Yi and Di, according to this commentary, the Chunqiu doesn't blame them. It simply says, okay, you know, tigers eat meat, right? Mosquitoes bite. There's no point in blaming a mosquito for biting you. It's in its nature, right? And the Yi and Di are sort of like that. They're not quite part of a moral community to the degree that you would expect them to behave morally, right? So you don't even try to integrate them into a moral community. That's the point of that not blaming. Or as the Zhongyong puts it, 非天子不依礼不制度不考文今天下车同轨书同文行同伦 right? To no one but the Son of Heaven does it belong to order ceremonies, to fix the measures, and to determine the written characters. Whoops, hold on, getting a little bit, oh yeah, it was all there. Now over the kingdom, carriages have all wheels of the same size, all writing is with the same characters, and for conduct there are the same rules. Political centralization and cultural exclusivity go hand in hand. With any act of cultural creation in imperial China, we need to carefully distinguish the expressive and normative strands, the statement of how things are and the statement of how things ought to be. An is and an ought are not the same. They don't quite contradict each other, though they can overlay each other and confuse the unwary observer. It may absolutely not be the fact that the Yi and Di music was given them by Yao and Shun or the Duke of Zhou. Its not being the case, however, does not hinder it from being, for a certain kind of official aesthetics, what ought to have been the case. And official aesthetics is always ready to enforce the doctrine that the normative is the actual. All right, it's not a good principle to live by, but official aesthetics doesn't care. The power to set norms derives from the creative act of the former kings. This is entirely in the spirit of Xunzi, who said 500 years before the Baihu Tong, 古者圣王以人性恶，以为偏贤而不正，拨乱而不治，是以为之其礼义，治法度。In ancient times, the sage kings saw that because people's nature is bad, they were deviant, dangerous, and not correct, unruly, chaotic, and not well ordered. Therefore, for their sake, the sage kings set up ritual and loyalty and established proper models and measures. Well, who could possibly be more deviant, dangerous, incorrect, unruly, and chaotic than the barbarians? But no sage king will ever, according to the Baihu Tong, succeed in reforming their nature. So they must be excluded from the provision of music inasmuch as proper music reflects ritual and bad music corrupts the public. We need to pause for a moment and work out the meaning of this term, yi, alien or barbarian. Who or what is a yi? The designation is a shifting one over the 3,000 or 4,000 years of its usage, but there are a few constants. Yi or feng in the oracle bone writings are outsiders as seen from within the Chinese cultural space. Some yi are nomads and live primarily from animal husbandry. Others are hillside gardeners and gatherers. They have different customs from those of the central states, and they speak incomprehensible languages, requiring translators to mediate. Usually, they do not have writing or walled cities. Numerical epithets like duofang, jiuyi, and baiyi point to their decentralized political organization and their confusing multiplicity. An epithet like siyi or sifang tries, in compensation, to put them in a system, like that system that we saw mapped just a moment ago with the 4 directions. To put them in a system, to control them verbally, to define them by their relation to the center. The difference marked in such words is hierarchical. Using the designation yi has the effect of excluding the people referred to from the realm of manners, morals, reason, ritual, music, li, and wen. Now, some years ago, Lydia Liu examined the use the colonial British made of the term yi in their early diplomatic communications with the Qing government. And she observes that yi functioned there as a super sign, not just a word with a meaning that could be agreed upon by participants in a conversation, but a word that became the stakes of the whole conversation itself, right? In her book, The Clash of Empires. In the 1840s, the British insisted that yi was an insulting term, and they demanded in the unequal treaty that concluded the First Opium War that yi be excluded from all future diplomatic communications. Right? It became taboo. The Chinese were not allowed to describe Westerners as yi anymore. I agree with Lydia here that the British were making a big fuss about nothing. They were just looking for a casus belli. They were looking for a reason to have an argument. They were using this term yi in bad faith as a pretext. But that doesn't mean that we should therefore believe the opposite, that yi was a perfectly inoffensive and relative term. The degree of offensiveness may be up to evaluation case by case. I wouldn't trust the British on that point, but still, we can look into the behaviors that are associated with the word and get a better sense of what it means. Relative, it certainly is not. Right? There are terms like bi and si, right? This one and that one, or nei and wai, inside and outside. Unlike such mere place markers as those, however, yi is not convertible. You can say that a native is foreign to a foreigner, and vice versa, but you can't say that a Chinese is yi to a foreigner, to a person who is yi, that is. Thus, the translation as foreign loses much of the word's specificity of reference. Yi is a word the sense of which depends on its use within a particular language game. Outside that game, it doesn't generalize. It would be straining the semantics to say that the Kazakhs, for example, are yi to Russians. There's just too much Chinese specificity involved to allow the word to be applied in that wider way. All right, so yi represents some kind of difference. But what kind of difference does yi indicate? It may look like ethnic or racial difference, though we need to be careful about the danger of projecting backwards in time concepts that were unavailable to our predecessors. Methods of classification of human beings are constantly being revised. And there is always the reminder from Mencius that the status of yi is not permanent, that yi is a way of behaving, a cultural category rather than a nationality or an ancestry. Shun and Zhou Wenwang, those founders of Chinese culture, were originally yi from the eastern and western regions, respectively. Right? You know this passage. Right? Oh, sorry. Here are the yi and some of its near synonyms. Right? And here is the Mencius passage I was meaning. Right? Right? Shun sheng yu zhu feng. Right? Dong yi zhi ren ye. Right? So Shun, this great hero of early Chinese culture, was a Dong-yi person. And Wenwang, an equally great later hero of Chinese culture, was a Xi-yi, was an Eastern yi. Right? But when it came to their principles, to their policies, to their appreciation of the Tao, they did exactly the same thing, right? Despite 1,000 years of difference and many miles of distance between them. So I think the essential thing about the status of E is the act of pronouncing difference. The objects to which that judgment of difference the objects to which that judgment of difference is applied can change over time, as when populations become sinicized or alien customs are adopted. E is a moving horizon, but as an actor category, E can appear to be a permanent inborn identity, as when Jiang Tong in the Western Jin drew together these traditional distinctions in order to name the Yi and ask that they be expelled as a danger to the central realm. Right, so here I have a passage from an essay by Jiang Tong, writing around the year 400, right, in the period of division, and requesting that the king of the time expel all of the Yi populations that had come to live side by side with the Chinese. Right? And he makes the traditional case about the Yi not really being very nice people to be around. He says, 一起语言不通, right? 制币不同, 法俗为异, 种类生疏, right? So their language is incomprehensible, their means of exchange is different, their laws and customs are awkward and strange, so their 种类, right, the kind that they belong to, is remote from ours. Then he goes on and describes, the out-of-the-way places where you're going to find E dwelling. He says they don't mix with us, and he seems to be happy about that. He says they don't pay tax, they don't offer corvée labor, they don't follow the calendar. Right? And so these people are really strangers in our midst, says Jiang Tong. Right? And he's got a good old text that says that when the Tianzi you dao, when the Son of Heaven is following the way, then 守在四夷, we are kept safe from the 4 yi. Okay? And he goes on to recommend identifying every Yi in the realm and kicking them out. He says this is the only way that we can be kept safe. This recommendation was not followed, and it's part of Chinese history that the relationship to the Yi, the continued invasions and foundings of new dynasties by Yi people, just became even more frequent after this essay was written. Now, Jiang Tong's insistence on an irreducible difference between Hua and Yi is just one phase of a relationship that endured over millennia. Recent research, like that of Nicola Di Cosmo and Tamara Chin, shows how influential the relationships between Hua and various groups designated Yi were over the course of Chinese history, how they varied, and what groups took an interest in framing that relationship in one or another way. Right? It was always a matter of polemic. None of this is sort of decided stuff, right? People are arguing all through the history. I'm simply pulling out some of the arguments that were offered, usually with a policy implication. I surmise that the cultural exclusivity expressed by the Bai Hutong and Jiang Tong's essay, whatever its purported basis in fact, is a typical move in struggles for authority among policy groups and schools of thought. Moreover, the persistence of that view on the superiority of the culture of the Central States indexes the permanent interests of the Wenren, the literati, who maintained that culture and drew from it their intellectual and social resources. They needed to be different from the Yi, and in that way they sort of needed the Yi in order to be who they were. As Erica Fox Brindley observes in her study of the Yue, right, another group of people classified among the Dong Yi, the Eastern Yi, she observes, ancient thinkers who leaned in the direction of strong traditionalist Zhu Confucian values and norms sometimes spoke of cultural interactions in terms of purely one-way civilizing projects, through the concept of educational reform, 教化, and one-way goals. Thus, if we are looking mainly at the archive of Wenxue, of literature, of poetry and historiography and aesthetic theory, we will not find a lot of documents treating Yi as fully human culture creators, right? Because Wen is such a basic Zhu value. So it may be that I am seeking fish at the top of the tree, right? In raising this whole question about barbarians making music and being sources of literature. Nonetheless, I persist. Central and alien identities motivate gestures of opening and closure. Thus, in the days of the Zhou, the music of exotic peoples played at court was a rare commodity that declared the glory and influence of the royal house. Right? There are lots of parallel passages in the early ritual texts and in the Shangshu where people are saying, hooray, we have tribute that's being brought from distant regions, right? Someone is unloading their local products on us. That shows how important we are. Right? Precisely because it came from far away and was imbued with otherness, this music was good and valuable. By Han times, however, that exotic eclecticism was under attack by the purists at court, whose voice dominates in the Baihutong and the Li Ji. Hence, I think the stiffening of the opposition between Zhongguo Zhiren, people of the central states, and Yi, among the court Confucians who speak in the Baihutong, and hence the projection of imperial autocratic cultural authority back into the Zhou past that we see in the Zhongyong statement about the Son of Heaven determining the rights and unifying the written characters. It's always puzzled me why people take the Zhongyong so seriously as an early document, right? Because at least this passage can't be. That kind of centralization could not be declared as a fact by someone living at the time of the supposed composition of the Zhongyong by Zisi, the grandson of Confucius, Zisi, whose dates are thought to be 481 to 401 before our era. It was a remarkable and radical proposal, the unification of the writing system and of the currency and of the wheel tracks and so forth, when it was put forth by Li Si shortly after the founding of the empire in 221 BC. So the Zhongyong passage must be indulging in a retrospective anachronism, seeking legitimation in the past for a policy that really dates from the Qin or Han. Ritual, music, letters, and all other tokens of social interchange must come from the hands of the sage king, says the Zhongyong. Other and lesser beings can only receive what the sage king has graciously bestowed. Though the Zhongyong passage carries this centralization and personalization to an extreme, we see a milder form of the same impulse in the Baihutong's refusal to let any cultural initiatives come from the barbarians. They won't even have their own music if the Baihutong authors get their way. Culture, or Wen, belongs only to the people of the central states. Can a barbarian sing? Is there such a thing as E and D music? Or would admitting the Yi and D to the ranks of music creators not subvert the whole hierarchy between culture and non-culture, on which the ideology of centralized empire depended? Can a barbarian exhibit Wen, that property reserved in this admittedly ethnocentric discourse, to the people of the central states? The conditions of acceptance were not always so strict. Consider this tale from Liu Xiang's Shuo Yuan. The story is dated perhaps legendarily to the 6th century BCE. The book, of course, is from the 1st century after. The Duke of Zixi, a nobleman from the state of Chu, was out on a boating excursion and heard one of the boatmen singing a song that will probably be just as puzzling to you as it was to the Duke of right? 兰溪边草溪 渔场横着渔场舟，舟看舟烟，忽琴徐徐，满语胡照弹琴语。Right? 真题随和乎? All right, so what does that nonsense mean? Right? Zixi is interested in the song, but he says, I can't understand it. Please try to say it to me in the language of Chu. And they call for a Yue translator who renders it in Chu language thus. And then they give a transcription in regular literary Chinese, which I suppose represents Chu much more effectively, right? And so here's the song as it's represented in Liu Xiang, right? 今夕何夕夕，千中周流。今日何日兮，得与王子同舟。蒙羞被豪兮，不知羞耻。心急玩而不决兮， 德之王子。山有木兮，木有志。心悦君兮君不知. Right? What night is it tonight that I take the boat to the middle of the stream? What day is it today that I get to accompany my prince on the boat? Ignorant and shy, I hide my affection for you, but I do not fear being exposed and denounced. Longing fills my heart and does not stop. I can now be acquainted with my prince. Mountains bear trees, trees bear branches. My heart rejoices in you, but you are not aware. And at this, the Duke stretched out his long sleeves, walked over and embraced him, then lifted up his embroidered cape and covered him with it. Right? Although, he's a boatman, so everything socially separates them. But the point of Liu Xiang's including this story in his book is that this is an act of persuasion. So again, they're separated by language, by status, by all kinds of, by odor, I'm sure, right? Because, rowing a big boat is hard work. And none of that matters once the message has been brought across. Now, this poem is the only surviving complete document in the extinct language of Yue, which was once an important kingdom in southeastern coastal China, inhabited by the Bai Yue, or 100 Yue, right? A bunch of different tribes, but all classified in the same category by Chinese historiographers. There has been a recent reinterpretation of this song by Zhengzhang Shangfang, and it finds that the ancient Yue words, as represented here, appear to be cognate with Thai and Burmese. Thus, at least in terms of language families, ancient Yue is not a dialect of Chinese at all. And of course, dialect is a bit of a problem word. My friend Victor Mayer prefers topolect, which just means local speech, right? Because topolect seems to release dialects from the idea of being derivative from a central or authoritative language, which is exactly what Victor wants to do. As the population and administration of the central states expanded southwards, the Thai-Burmese speakers presumably had to choose between assimilating and retreating. They went southwards. Right? They constituted the population of other areas and states. In any case, the Song of the Boatman as transcribed here displays its alien quality. And it's rare for a Han Dynasty author to quote a foreign text this long in the original. By including it among the examples of deft persuasion, Liu Xiang, who is certainly a dweller in the capital, a consummate insider, he was, of course, the chief librarian of the Han, and with his imperial surname, he was as representative a figure of centralized culture as one could wish. But nonetheless, Liu Xiang uses this exotic language to demonstrate the power of words, even when the words are incomprehensible and they are sung by a humble oarsman from Yue, who is therefore one of the Dongyi, right, one of the eastern barbarians. At the date Liu Xiang assigns the anecdote, some 600 years anterior to his present, both Chu and Yue would have counted as territories alien to the Zhou polity and its rituals. Right? Chu not completely alien, but if you read the Zuozhuan, whenever Chu is talked about, people sort of raise their eyebrows. Those were relatively exotic people, though they were within the Zhou system of ritual and diplomacy. So in this case, the barbarian does sing, although no Huaxia interests are harmed thereby. Another direct transcription of foreign song appears in the Houhan Shu, the history of the later Han. Around the year 60 of our era, a young official eager to make a name for himself, named Zhu Fu, was appointed to the post of governor of Yizhou, a vast territory in the southwest, roughly equivalent to today's Sichuan province. He was so successful at 宣示汉德, 威怀原夷, right, at proclaiming the greatness of the Han and winning the loyalty of distant and alien peoples, that members of the Bailang, Panmu, and Tangzu tribes, numbering as many as 6 million, I rubbed my eyes when I saw that number too, numbering as many as 6 million, came wishing to pay tribute and become subjects of the Han Emperor. Zhu Fu wrote a memorial to accompany a delegation of representatives to the capital, where they went to make their request. They were escorted by officials carrying 3 songs that the Bailang had composed, in a transcription of the original text, presumably in Lolo Burmese, of some dialect of their own, as well as a translation into Chinese. In the time of the sage kings, said Zhufu in his letter of transmittal, it was the custom to dance the music of the 4 alien tribes. Perhaps that time has come around again, and the songs I enclose herewith will supply a new example of the same. 习在圣地无四夷之乐，今之所上，孰备其一? Right? So this is nice flattery to his emperor, right? Saying you're a sage king, and the proof of this is that these alien people are coming, requesting to be admitted to your empire. Well, that was a nice bit of flattery, and the poems too must have pleased the Han Emperor. The first one, which is titled Song of Distant Aliens Rejoicing in Virtue, reads thus. This is South Coblin's translation from his little article of 30 or so years ago about this set of songs. Right? So you can see, it's even if you don't speak Chinese, you can see that it's very regular. Oh dear, we're missing the top line. Well, sorry about that. It begins by saying 大汉失治，与天合一，离异平端，不从我来. Right? So the great Han is in good order. Together with heaven it unites its intention. The officials and translators are just and upright. They did not, pursuing us, cause us to come. Right? So they're saying we're doing this entirely of our own volition. Right? And we've learned about the civilizing influence, right? 向化, facing the civilizing influences. We are amazed, and people are giving us these wonderful gifts. We are totally happy. They're taking care of us so wonderfully. And, we poor and thin barbarians have nothing to give you in repayment, right? 蛮夷贫饱, right? 无所报赐, we have nothing to give you back. So we wish you a Merry Christmas. No, that's not what they said. We wish you great longevity, and we wish that your sons and grandsons will be splendid and glorious, right? So, although it does really sound exactly like a Christmas carol being sung in front of the office of a powerful person who's supposed to distribute some largesse, some gold coins, right? So it's a lovely, humble little song. It hits all of the notes of this self-description by the Han of their great virtue and their welcoming of alien peoples. This is exactly how and what a barbarian is supposed to sing. But now a new puzzle arises. If a group of and if it's a group of 6 million individuals, that's quite a big group, right? That's the number given in the history of the later Han. If a group of asks to be included in the Chinese nation, are they still considered Are their descendants, who presumably will follow Chinese customs, also or will they be counted among the Zhuxia, among the Chinese? Is anyone keeping track? I will speak in a later lecture about efforts to classify the population over history, but for now, let the problem be framed in terms of culture, or indeed of poetics. Does the author of the Bailang songs speak from an alien point of view, or from a point of view so closely identified with that of the Chinese Empire that it might as well be Chinese? An opportunity for making such subtle distinctions falls into the crack between the Bailang text of the songs and their Chinese translation. For although we have what purport to be the words of the songs in the Bailang language, transcribed into Eastern Han Chinese, we do not have a reliable lexicon or grammar of Bailang, so we can't check the accuracy of the translation at all. The fact that the Chinese text is given in the Hohan Shu is so neatly composed in regular 4-character verses with end rhymes, and is adorned with allusions to the Book of Songs and the Analects of Confucius, leaves us room to wonder how much in the comprehensible text is a free elaboration by the translating officials of some original that might have had quite a different style and content. Right? They might have actually said, We, the Bailang, have come to threaten you with our magic and our weapons and our poisons. Give us everything we ask for or else. But, the officials, they know that that's not going to be heeded, so they provide something a little bit more emollient. And in the end, everybody's happy, right? That's what matters. So that we don't know how much is being provided by the translating officials. South Coblin and then later another scholar have gone over the sound transcription of the song and tried to correlate it with Burmese and Thai etymological terms, but they're operating on the assumption that the Chinese text is a faithful translation, right? So they're just looking for correlations. Where the Chinese text says X, they say, all right, are there any words in Thai that sound like this word and also mean X, right? So I don't see them questioning the reliability of the translation, but that from my amateur ethnographic point of view is exactly what I'm unfortunately tempted to do. I wonder how much happened in the course of translation. I would say that once again this seems to be translation as citation, a translation that anticipates the needs of the target language audience to such a degree that the source language and its public are lost sight of. Perhaps the accompanying officials wrote in Chinese verse what they thought the Bailang elders ought to have said or would have said had they had the proper cultural equipment. Yes, the Barbarians can sing, but on the condition that their song match Huaxia cultural requirements. Otherwise, their song will have to remain outside the gate. Well, I said the Barbarians can sing, but does this really count as barbarian singing, right? Or is it Han ventriloquism using the Barbarians as a kind of a puppet and pretext? Quite a problem. Attempting to write up a multicultural history of Chinese literature, which is exactly what I'm trying to sketch out in these 5 talks, attempting to do that means dashing the two words, multicultural and literature, against each other. The very concept of literature has so persistently been identified with Chineseness, with the models of antiquity, that it has the effect of filtering the corpus of literary texts. Is wen, right, literature or culture or refinement, is wen an inherently ethnocentric term? Or, if it makes a difference here, is it a cultural-centric one? Remember Dao An and the authors of the Baihu Tong? Dao An points out that the Indian Buddhist texts prize matter, zhi, and the Chinese audiences love not matter but pattern. Right? He says, 二者虎经上直, 秦人好文. Right? They love zhi and we love wen. Right? And that's one of his points in saying why you have to change things in translation if anyone is going to read you. The Baihu Tong states boldly that 以地直不如中国文, right? The E and D barbarians are they're full of matter, right? They're substantive, and they are not the equals of the central states as far as wen is concerned, right? They don't have the wen of the central states. A system of correlations seems to develop here where Chineseness and wen occupy a central position and a rotating cast of others who supply zhi but no wen, substance but no pattern, fill out the rest of the world. Right? So one recognizes the echo of Confucius and the Analects pointing out the deficiency of an overabundance of zhi, which makes for savagery, as opposed to an overabundance of wen, which makes for pedantry. Right? That's the last quote up there, where zhi and wen are being put in opposition and in a way balanced against each other. But the problem of educated Chinese people would be having too much wen and therefore becoming shi, becoming like a scribe, becoming pedantic. That's not the problem of the Barbarians, of the Yi, who have too much zhi and no wen to speak of. The difficulty of people from outside the culture of the central states ever reaching the status of wen are participating in the creation of the kind of text we have come to regard as the literary inheritance of China takes many forms. Sometimes outright exclusion, sometimes transformation in the course of appropriation, sometimes what I call evaporation, where a foreign cultural product subsists only as a name, a vestige, or a tune. After the collapse of the Han, many dynasties and would-be dynasties ruled over parts of China. Quite a few of these were, technically speaking, barbarian. Lineages that had originated among the Xianbei, or the Tuoba, or other groups, ruled over a territory with an administration patterned on that of the Han, with ideologies of rulership that mixed the Zhou classics with the traditions of the steppe and Buddhist political theory. The northern Wei, the Liao, the many Liang, the Jin, and even the great Tang were all of foreign or mixed origin. It was hard to deny the Yi a role in the shaping of civilization for people after the Han. The high literary culture changed more slowly, however, because to write was to adopt the enduring, resistant forms handed down from the past. After the six dynasties, the Sui and the Tang, multicultural China was a reality, and the insistence on archaism, on returning to the fundamentals, on the purity of the classics, sounds very much like a refusal to recognize what was actually going on and to substitute standards for observations. Not the same thing at all. I'm, of course, thinking of Han Yu and the Fugu movement, which is also an anti-foreigner movement in writing. Barbarian song survives in ethnographic writing. That's the only place you'll find it. For example, the memoirs on foreign nations that fill up the last few chapters of each dynastic history. Even when the ruling family of the dynasty was itself of foreign origin, you still see the barbarians packed into the last few chapters. You find barbarian song also in biographies of individuals who deal with aliens or who turn out to have a hybrid past. In the year 546, while besieging the Western Wei stronghold of Yubi, the general Gao Huan, whose son went on to found the Eastern Wei dynasty, fell ill, as had much of his army. The king of the defenders claimed that Gao Huan had already been killed in a bid to weaken the attacker's will. Forcing himself up from his sickbed, Gao asked the Xianbei general Hulu Jin to start up a song from their common birthplace of Chile, and sang it along with him. Here's how it goes. Right? 直了川，银山下，天似穹庐，笼盖四野，天苍苍，野茫茫，风吹草低见有阳。The Chile River flows beneath Mount Yin. The heavens are like a yurt cover thrown over the four directions. The heavens so vast, the wild so infinite, the wind blows, the grass parts, cattle and sheep appear. The Yuefu Shiji, a collection of verse made in the 1300s by Guo Maoqian, right? The Yuefu Shiji adds, this song was originally in the Xianbei language. It has been translated into Qi words, and for that reason its lines are of unequal length. So perhaps the translators were trying harder to cling to the meaning and not overdo the preparation of the translation for a foreign public. No original has been preserved, although the text in the history, it tells us that the song was sung in the Chile language. According to a modern literary historian, Luo Yuming, this composition depicts the landscape of the wide prairie in the north and the nomadic life. The boundless and eternal infinity of the scene also reflects the broad mind and heroic spirit of the singer. Thus far, Luo Yuming. Well, that's what you'd expect from a nomadic steppe dweller, isn't it? Not refinement, but a naive depiction of the reality of the steppes, with an authorial personality to suit. Here indeed barbarians may sing, and not necessarily sing a song of their submission to imperial norms, but the alternative to the style of the Bailang elders is simply a song about being a nomad. if you should seek information about the Chile and their song in dictionaries or on Wikipedia, here's what you get. Right? The 现代汉语规范词典, the standard dictionary of modern Chinese, says that the Chile are 我国古代北方少数民族之一，以游牧为生. Right? They are one of the northern national minorities of our country, and they lived by nomadic pasturage. Right? And then, there's the Wikipedia definition, which is probably just copied off some dictionary, which also goes into the business about there being 我国少数游牧民族, right? A member of the Xianbei. Those descriptions, right? National minorities of our country, right? Those descriptions reflect current mainland policy on the teaching of Chinese history, but they are absurdly anachronistic. In the northern and southern dynasties, the Chile were hardly one of our national minorities living from nomadic pasturage, but a leading military and political force. Had they been in charge of writing the entries for future historical dictionaries, they might well have described the Huaxia as one of our national minorities who live from grain cultivation and weaving. Rather too obviously in this case, history, lexicography even, is written by the winners long after the battle is done. But in the moment of the song's composition, the future was wide open, though it may take some imagination on our part to recover it. To use that imagination and to try to recover the open future is a form of resistance required of us, lest we fall into the habit that James Scott calls seeing like a state. You know which state I mean. It's the one that decides who is a national minority and who is not. I don't think we have to worry about seeing like the long-gone Chile state. Let's restore the Chile perspective, insofar as we can, to the singing of the song. Gao Huan, a Xianbei-ized Han military man, right, person of Han descent, but who has lived among the Xianbei for most of his life. He's ill, dejected, and rumored to be dead. He calls his companion in arms, Hu Lujin, to remind him and their soldiers, with a song, of what they have in common, their Xianbei background, symbolized by the vast landscape, the freedom and the mobile riches that make the Chile invincible in the long run. Maybe he is thinking of making a break for it and retiring to those peaceful pasture lands. In any case, Hu Lujin's singing is an ethnic performance meant to make an impression on an audience of mixed Huaxia and Han hearers, and in no way an accommodation to Huaxia norms, despite the fact that it survives only in Chinese translation. So there's one case of singing like a barbarian. A little bit stereotypical, but still worth our attention. A Tu Yu Hun song, mentioned and preserved only in Chinese translation, comes with an origin story recorded in the Jin Shu. Oh, sorry, there was my reference to James Scott, Seeing Like a State, a book that everyone should read, I think. So here's the story about the Tu Yu Hun song. Right? And so it explains that there were once two brothers who were the sons of the chief of this group of Xianbei people. One of them was named Tu Yu Hun, and one of them was named Murong Wei. And Murong was the oldest of the legitimate sons, and Tu Yu Hun was the oldest of the sons, period, but he was the son of a concubine, so he didn't have the status that his other brother had. And the father, before he died, divided up the pasture lands and said, okay, you get this piece of pasture land, and you, the other brother, get that piece of pasture land. But the horses kept on jumping over the boundaries and eating the grass on the other side. And so one of the two brothers, Murong Wei, got angry and scolded his brother. And the brother, who's named Agan here, the brother got up with his followers, several thousand followers, and rode off to the west. And so Murong Wei, the brother who was left behind, then felt very guilty, and he said, I've got to call him back. And he told his horsemen to jump on their horses and chase him, but their horses wouldn't go, right? And so the his chief cavalry officer came back and said, look, it's, the horses, it's their fault. And Murongwei said, okay, this is just, this is heaven, right? This is not a matter that human beings can control. And so since there was nothing he could do to call back his brother, who went off and founded a kingdom of his own far to the west, the remaining brother composed the song of Agan Zhige, and at the end of the year it says he would sit and think regretfully about his brother and sing it over and over again. All right? And so then here we have this song, all right, which I will put in front of you here, right? All right. So it reads approximately like this. Agan has left for the west. I am downhearted. Agan might have come home, but the horses would not bring him back. Tell me, do horses always fight? Our Agan has gone off to the west. Agan endures bitter cold. He left us for the desert where the Bailang dwell. We see the setting sun, but no longer see Agan, alas. When will I ever meet another Agan? This is apparently that rare thing, a poem from the Barbarians that is not about their relation to the Chinese. It marks an important moment in the history of the Murong clan, who were later to have a great role in Chinese history, founding several dynasties. And it situates the moment of poetic composition in a political crisis, exactly as the prefaces to the songs in the Book of Songs often do. So I would consider this, even apart from the fact of its being a translation, a hybrid text with some features of Chinese classical composition and some features of the steppe song. Also symptomatic of its doubtful standing among works of literature for people of the pre-modern era is the fact that the Jinshu gives the circumstances of its composition in the title, but no song. For that, you have to go to much later compilations. The Yuefu Shiji, for example, lists a number of similar titles among the Heng Chui Ge, the songs for performance with flute, songs that have a nomad or frontier background, but it doesn't give this song. The earliest printing of the Song of Agan that I've been able to find so far is in a local gazetteer for Gaolan County, compiled in 1775, year 39 of Qianlong. So the hunt is open. If you can find an earlier printing of this song, I will thank you, I will buy you coffee, I will put your name in my footnotes. So several alternatives offer themselves to us. It is possible, but hard to prove, that oral transmission carried the song through 1,500 years of history and translation into Chinese. It is more likely, I think, that the song as we have it today is a later reconstruction reflecting what somebody thinks Murongwei ought to have sung rather than what he actually sang. This does not in the least hinder scholars who quote, anthologize, and interpret the Agan Zhige. It doesn't prevent them from citing in their footnotes the Jinshu as if that historical work were the source for the poem rather than just the source of the story about the poem's creation. I've collected about 10 instances of this, where people, they anthologize the poem, they say, for the text, see Jinshu, and okay, there might be a commented edition where somebody has added it in a footnote, but it's not actually the locus of first publication as far as I can tell. It is as if no one wanted to admit that the song is really a piece of synthetic folklore. In this case, the Barbarians must sing because we know what they should have sung, and the circumstance is too important to let it pass without a song. I have by no means exhausted the stock of translated foreign poetry in Chinese, though the archive is not a huge one. The conditions leading to the patchy survival of foreign song texts in pre-modern China include the restrictive literary codes I've mentioned, a lack of translators, the passage of time, the sheer variety of idioms that had contributed to the musical repertoire, and the fact that the words were often noted just as a means of recording the tune, which itself often eventually faded from memory. I should not like to give the impression that pre-modern Chinese people were uniquely chauvinistic. The Greeks and Romans were hardly any better at preserving or appreciating the traces of alien creativity. Julius Caesar led a massive expedition into Gaul and wrote a short ethnography of its inhabitants. In it, you will find no summaries of their literature, no vocabulary lists, only personal and place names of the kind that you also find copiously recorded in the Chinese dynastic histories. A major civilization often obliterates those around it. Against this tendency, the collecting habits of Chinese courts, which despite all the exclusionary theories of Confucian ideologues, continued to treasure tunes and rhythms from outside the realm, are a cultural recognition of the hybridity that was the lived reality of Chinese people in all ages. Massive importation of foreign music occurred in all imperial dynasties. The words of foreign songs were evanescent, though the song titles might survive. We read an account of this in the Jiutang Shu, in the chapter about music. Let's see. Here is, by the way, here's the earliest printed source for the Agan Zhige as far as I can tell. So here is the Jiutang Shu, little section about music. And it says, what is known as the music of the northern Yi includes that of the Xianbei, the Tuyuhun, and the Buluoji. All such music is performed on horseback. 53 compositions of this kind subsist today, and 6 titles can still be understood. All right, well, 53 minus 6, right? That means there were 47 titles that no one could understand anymore. There was some kind of a guild tradition where the musicians preserved knowledge of the tunes and the performance, and maybe they could still sing the words, but they had no idea what the words meant, right? They were just lip syncing. And then it gives some titles of a few of the songs. These are the titles that make sense, and they're all rather exotic. They're proper names, right? The songs that cannot be understood contain many repetitions of the word kan, right? Kohan. You know, I read this and I imagine some 39th century historian saying, the songs of the Beatles have been transmitted to us. They contain many repetitions of the word yeah, yeah, yeah. And the songs of the Rolling Stones frequently include the word baby, right? The word baby also occurs in Martin Gay. You can imagine, the wonderful philology that they'll be doing on our culture in future times. But so here, the Tang historians, they don't understand anything about the songs, although clearly they've been preserved, but they've been preserved as meaningless sounds, and it's just, ahan or kuhan all the time. And they say, the northern warriors call their leader kuhan, right? The Khan, like the great Khan. All right, so the Tuyuhun are an offshoot lineage of the Murong, and it appears that the song bearing their name arose as a Xianbei song on the border of Yan and Wei, or probably, I'm sorry, I think I need to correct that, around the time of the Yan dynasties and the Wei dynasty. There's several overlapping dynasties named Yan and Qianhou and Nanbei Yan, all around the year 400, right? Which is about the time of the Wei. So that's what the text is saying, right? It's dating the poem rather than giving it geographical origin. It says, the song's words, I suppose that this might very well be the Agan song that they're here just calling the Tuyuhun song. The song's words are no bad sounds and cannot be understood. Although no translator today is able to understand all the words, it is most likely that the song's authentic meaning has been lost to the passage of time anyway. That is, not even a Tuyuhun or a Xianbei could tell you what the song means now, right? So there's tremendous loss, what I call evaporation, right? There was once a lot of content, but somebody forgot to put a cork in the bottle, and when you go back hoping to pour out some of that nice foreign whiskey, it's all evaporated, and you have only the bottle and the label. Tragic. Foreignness is everywhere in Tang poetry, and not just as a marker denoting the outside of China. In literary contexts, it often subsists only as a shell of former meanings, however. The disappearance of foreign content, leaving only titles and tunes, is visible throughout Guo Maoqian's great collection, Yuefu Shiji, the collection of music bureau songs. I'll be talking about that next time, by the way. The music and poetry of the Tang court were full of importations, right? We have the records of that. The Dunhuang Caves, which I'll also be talking about in the future, show tremendous intellectual and artistic traffic with other realms, with Turks, with Arabs, with Sogdians, with Tibetans. This is something we know from the preserved records of that marginal place. But if we were to trust the conventional literary histories of China, or the official histories of the dynasties, such contributions were only local and superficial, not affecting Chinese literature's consistent stream of development from the Shijing onward. I think I have given some reasons, good reasons I hope, to distrust such affirmations. I will be looking at the genre of literary history and its devices for maintaining identity despite change in a future talk. For now, let me close with the words of Li Shimin, founding emperor of the Tang, spoken to an official who was urging him, like Jiang Tong in the Six Dynasties, to strike hard and eliminate the foreigners in the empire's midst. And Li Shimin said, "The yi and di, yi di yi ren er, qi qing yu zhong xia bu shu, ren ru huan de ze bu jia, bu bi cai ji yi lei, gai de ze qia ze si yi ke shi ru yi jia, cai ji duo ze gu rou bu mian wei chou di." The yi and di are human beings too, and their feelings are not much different from those of the Chinese. The Lord of Men is anxious only about failing to benefit others. There is no need to be suspicious of people of a different kind. Through benevolence, the four barbarians can be made to join us in a single family. But if suspicion predominates, we cannot even be sure our own flesh and bone is on our side. I think Li Shimin was right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hector, for the invitation to come. And thank you, Haun, for the fascinating talk. It's a great honor to be invited to comment on Haun's paper. And at first experience, it's odd that I'm invited because I don't do comparative literature, and I am a historian, not a literary scholar. Okay. And who wasn't even trained in Chinese history. But on the other hand, it seems fair that this lecture is not too much comparative literature. At least it's not conventionally literary. And indeed, even Haun characterized his talk as a cultural history, multicultural history, although based in Chinese literature. And so, as a cultural historian, and especially one who has training in European history and languages, I am to some extent qualified to say something about his paper. And so, the title of the talk is "Can the Barbarians Sing?" And the answer is, of course, they can. And time again, Haun said in his talk that the barbarians can sing, and even barbarians must sing. Actually, everybody can sing except me, because whatever tunes that I make are so bad that they don't qualify as music. But what's great about Haun's paper is that he takes a fascinating perspective. He looks at music or dance instead of literature, and there's a good reason for that. And so the cultures that in Chinese antiquity that he surveyed, or his literature surveys, had no written languages. So when they were first documented, and let alone any literature that has been preserved until today. And interestingly, Haun ends his survey in this lecture with the Tang. So what the Chinese literati from the Tang on would do on occasions where the barbarians would sing, was that they would write a poem to show their cultural refinement, which serves as a contrast to the manner of the barbarians that Haun suggests. So I think that there is a great contrast there. But what he did in his lecture was really to historicize the reception of alien music. And this reception, he argues, reflects the course of power and cultural centralization in Chinese history. So he started with Bai Wu Tong, and that was written in the later Han, in the Eastern Han, when the country had been unified for a few centuries. And that was a time when court Confucians tried to purge any remaining morality or cultural status that the barbarians might have deserved. And he took at he discussed music in the context of the discussion of Li and Yue, right? So these barbarians had music, but they actually they are immoral. They don't have moral because they don't have Li or they don't deserve Li. So Han spent the bulk of his lecture surveys this discussion, and then conscientiously he looked hard into the literature about alien music that didn't subject barbarians to the Chinese domination, and he found out quite a few, and some of them actually come from the age of the five Wus, the Wu who actually disrupted political order in Chinese history, and that was when they didn't have to show their submission to the central states or to the Chinese authorities, because the Wus became the central states then. And he closed his talk with the Taizong of the Tang, Li Shimin, and who was benevolent and even culturally inclusive, and with his stance toward the aliens, because he himself was an alien, and he was one of the Wu. Yeah. And this is, I would say, it's a timely project that is long overdue. But I would say that it's not politically correct to study the multicultural or multi-ethnic history of China, especially today, when millions of Uyghurs are imprisoned just because they are not Chinese enough. And similar tragedies are happening to Tibetans and to Muslims and Christians who are even ethnically Chinese. But this project is easier for Han to do than for the Chinese intellectuals to do. A good example is our common friend Ge Zhaoguang. In his 何谓中国, he tries to justify the legitimacy of Chinese history. And for me, that is a wrong question to ask or to answer, because nobody questions the legitimacy of Chinese history. But he thought that what the Chinese historians in the West do was to delegitimize Chinese history. And that's not true, because they wanted to challenge the essentialization or the continuity of Chinese history that had been assumed in the historical writings. But then Ge Zhaoguang takes it as a challenge to the legitimacy of Chinese history. And so what he does was to defend he defends Chinese history against Western historians who want to emphasize the local and the non-Chinese elements of Chinese history by emphasizing the cultural essence of the Chinese nation that continue over millenniums. I think this is his argument. But then when I pointed this out to him, and he said that as a Chinese historian, a conscientious one, and I believe he's conscientiousness, he said he's 左右为难. When he is challenged by Western historians, he wants to defend the value of Chinese history at least the way it has been done in China in the past or today. But lately, he has also been talking about the barbarians that he had come across. In Guizhou, he was exiled to Guizhou during the Cultural Revolution. And he still saw the traces of the barbarians in terms of language, in terms of their different cultures. And he pointed out that the Chinese, when they first ruled Guizhou in the Ming Dynasty and continuing in the Qing Dynasty, the Chinese took it for granted that Chinese culture actually was the universal civilization, and they tried to apply the civilization to the peoples in Guizhou. And he knows that this is wrong, or this is not the only version of Chinese history. And so in this sense, he's very conscientious, and I admire that. But I told the host that not to take my comment here, because he has been, the Zhaoguang has been doing this implicitly. But if I make it explicit and this is circulated on the internet, this might put him in a very awkward position, and I don't want that to happen. All right. And so then come my questions. So the first one is this. Haun points out that the multicultural and multi-ethnic origin of China actually has been purged since the Han Dynasty on. And my question is it fair to say that this multicultural, multi-ethnic origin was rediscovered only when China came into contact with Western modernity, and especially the historical and philological scholarship that was done in the 19th and 20th century. The 19th, because China went into contact with West again in the 19th century. And the examples of Western antiquity in Greece and in Rome, and also ancient India that was studied by Oriental philologists, that made Chinese scholars like Fu Sinian and Chen Yingke, that I studied in one of the papers I published, realize that China actually had a multicultural, multi-ethnic past. So that's my first question. And then Han pointed out that the aliens had different places in the literary inheritance of China, and they can be outright exclusion, and they may be transformed in the course of appropriation as people submissive to the Chinese authority, or they can simply evaporate. And there's one more possibility that Han didn't point out, and I want to bring it up here. There is the case of Mulan. Mulan was a young woman who joined the army on behalf, instead of his brother and father. And Mulan actually, the actual Mulan was a Xianbei. But later on, the Chinese legends made Mulan an ethnic Chinese, and they celebrated her as one of the true Chinese daughters, or a son at a point.
Yeah.
All right. So this is an assertion, to some extent, of a non-Chinese hero as a Chinese one. So at least we have one case of extraordinary case that a non-Chinese took on moral superiority, although she was synthesized in this case. And then Han, at least in his paper version, compared the Chinese with the ancient Greeks and the Romans. And he said that the Greeks and Romans were hardly any better at preserving or appreciating the traces of alien creativity. And I beg to differ, actually. Okay, there are a lot of similarities. But the difference is, the first difference is that at least ancient Greeks saw equal states, languages, and cultures that were different. They were very aware of the different city-states at the time. And there were accounts that they actually spoke different languages. And they they were taken as peers, not as subordinates. And in China, very little is left, but at least mentions passage that Hans quotes, acknowledge the barbarian origins of Sun and the Zhou dynasty. All right. And I hope there are more, and I'll be happy to see more if you can find them.
Yeah.
And the second difference is that the Romans acknowledge the superiority of Greek language and culture. All right. Although they actually rule over the Greek remnants, so to speak, or a huge Greek speaking population. And Greek language actually still was still used. And the great edition, Galen, for example, was a Roman citizen who wrote in Greek. And so I think so those are notable differences. And finally, coming back to the nature of literature, I think Haun's talk can be justified as literary history because his language is literary and his talk was beautiful. And he used poetic devices. For example, he keeps going back to the theme of the singing of the barbarians, right? And to bring back the audience attention to his theme. And I think that was a very success. That was very nicely and very beautifully done. And so I don't question your qualification as a literary scholar or even a poet. But I'm not. I just fear that I'm not as good as you are. But I try my best to present my comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kevin. You're absolutely as if you're reading my mind when you mentioned Ge Zhaoguang and his book 何谓中国? What is China? Zhao Guang and I have been talking about this for years, and he's always saying, no, you can't use the terms that are habitual in Europe to describe China. It's just China is unique. Yes, it has some things in common with other nations, but it's long past and its previous imperial status mean that you just can't apply the terms. So every time I try to go at him with Renan's famous essay about what is a nation, he says, doesn't apply. This is a conversation we've been having many times over the years. And I think in Zhao Guang there is a desire for there to be some thread of continuity that you can use to link everything, and correspondingly an anxiety that thread might not be found. Right? I think that anxiety is pretty widely shared. So I realize that I'm sort of playing, if not with fire, at least with the electric circuits, and I may get a little shock here and there. But the definition of Chineseness is strange and difficult today, partly because, of course, China has inherited the shape of the former Manchu Empire, which was not quite Chinese either, right? And it includes a lot of people whose relationship to Yao and Shun and Zhougong is not exactly intimate, right? And so, I mean, there were fascinating discussions about this in the early years of the Republic, a little bit more than 100 years ago, right? Some people thought, okay, let's let Mongolia go, let's let Turkestan go, let's let the Manchus go. We don't need them. We will have, the Shubasheng, right? The 18 provinces of China are sufficient. But then, another interest that eventually triumphed said, no, we have to hang on to all that territory. Because if we let parts of it go, then the foreigners, the British, the Japanese, the French, will jump in and start colonizing those areas, and we can't allow that to happen. That would be very dangerous for us. So there was a whole series of discussions that began, I think, as cultural demarcation and a willingness to let the Yi or the Hu go their own way. But then once it became an argument about interest, right, and about self-defense, the whole nature of the thing changed. Right? So that's a fascinating moment that I probably won't have time to talk about in the remainder of these talks, but it's been very much on my mind. And because of some curious developments in Chinese history, we were very free in the way that we think about these things in Taiwan, right? Because I came to Taiwan in the days when there were still Tibetan and Manchurian representatives sitting in the Guohui. You know, this was before the CHANG reforms, right? The reforms of deprovincialization and all of that. So we were all kind of living in more consciousness of this imperative to maintain the Qing dynasty boundaries, although of course, practically speaking, they had become quite fictional. And you know, the poor Tibetan representatives were 97 years old and had to come to the Guohui in a wheelchair with a nurse standing behind them. It was really, you know, kind of an allegory of anachronism being lived out in daily life. So today in Taiwan, of course, we can look on those things and not feel that there's a normative shape that we must pretend to believe in that is China, right? So that might have felt like a loss for many people, but it's also a terrific gain. Yes, so I hope this is a timely project. I do think that we need to rethink the whole notion of multiculturalism, simply because the way that the vocabulary that we have for talking about it has developed is dependent on European and American experiences, which are post-colonial or are features of settler societies. And the Chinese experience in many ways echoes those, but is different and also has a much longer history. Right? So I'm hoping that this will be timely, not just because of the plight of people who are being imprisoned and dehumanized in mainland China, but because of the difficulty of retaining the positive conversation about multiculturalism in an era when, you know, in Europe and America, the most popular subject is how terrible the immigrants are and how we have to build walls and stop the flow of immigration. And, you know, in Britain with Brexit, you get an increase in hostility, expressed hostility and violence toward immigrants, right? And these are not necessarily visibly different immigrants, but people with accents, for example, now, you know, often report being spoken to in the street by hostile Brits who think that they don't have an accent. I think they all have an accent, by the way. So anyway, it is, alas, a timely project. And I hope that by thinking through the Chinese experiences around multiculturalism, we can come up with better definitions and definitions that are less blinded by just one set of experiences and one set of expectations. The legitimacy of states, you know, always a ticklish question, and it's a great resource to be able to look back over 25 dynastic histories and see how the legitimacy of the state had to be renegotiated every time, because of course each state comes along and they echo the same classic works and they pretend that they're stepping in the footsteps of the great Zhou, but of course each time it's a whole different thing. And if you're reading for the divergences, then it becomes much more entertaining. So, you know, that's a way of looking at Chinese history that would be not about continuity, but about discontinuity, and not take discontinuity as a kind of an attack on the existence of China, right? It can be a discontinuous thing that has to be restaged and started up again like a clock every few hundred years. Fu Xinyan and Chen Yingke are people who have been very inspirational for me. I envy them, their language knowledge, their ability to synthesize an impossibly broad amount of information. You can read over their scholarship and always gain something from it. I'm conscious that I'm just trying to light a very small candle at their enormous bonfire. But I think that in their way, they're also rediscovering their predecessors in Chinese history. So people who were likewise interested in contacts with the outside, right? The monks who went to India, very important for Chen Yingke. The Central Asian travelers who brought word of different religions and different ways of living. They were in the first generation that was able to exploit the Dunhuang documents that give us such a different China. You know, I sometimes think that the way to rethink Chinese history would be to make it all begin at Dunhuang and then include the rest as a footnote. That would be kind of a radical proposal, but it would be a fun proposal. It would change a lot. And yeah, the process of Sinicization, this is something that we all learned about. I mean, speaking as, you know, as a convert, let's say, as a person who came to China later in life, who sat in a lot of classrooms and learned all about Hanhua. And, you know, this is one of the things that was simply presented to us as a fact, right? Everyone invaded China. Everyone got Hanhua, got Sinified or Sinicized. It's an inexorable process, proved most recently by the Manchus, who forgot their own language, who stopped riding horses, who no longer shot with bows, greatly disappointing their emperors who wanted them to go on in the same way. But that was kind of a triumphal narrative that I think had a special power for people writing just after the end of the Manchu dynasty and the recovery of what was felt to be Han sovereignty over China, right? So Hanhua has a powerful ideological appeal. You know, the idea that no one can resist Hanhua. I'm not sure that that's quite the way it works, though, because we also have lots and lots of Huhua or Yihua that actually happens, although documents like the Baihutong and the Li Ji condemn it most vigorously. But lots of cases of people who found that their interests were better served by taking on an alien identity and maybe taking on a dual identity, right? People like this Gao Huan, you know, in the 6th century, who's a Han, but he spends most of his life with the Xianbei. He leads Xianbei troops. He's culturally, he's much more Xianbei than Han, and he eventually founds a dynasty that is also hybrid, right? His son is the first emperor of the Northern Wei.
And also the case of Xixia.
Yeah.
Xixia was the Han leader, but there was a foreign nation.
Yeah. And you know, they even reject the Chinese character. They say, we can do better than that. And they invent their own form of character, which about 3 people living in the world today can read. It's so difficult. But yeah, so, you know, I think that there is, of course, it's like, you know, it's kind of Newtonian, right? There's a gravitational pull of the immensity of Han China that tends to suck everything into its orbit. But if we can try to resist and follow the people who went out of Han China toward the outside and adopted techniques that were new and different and maybe changed things on the inside of China, that's a different narrative that I like to tell, particularly in this era of intense political Han centralization and, you know, exacerbation of the one-party state and the one-man rule. I take that as a very grim sort of situation to which we can respond, I hope, by showing the virtues and the real effects of multiculturalism as it's lived, right? Not just an ideology, but as a practice. So I'm with Li Shimin for sure.
We always get out
Yeah. All right. So thank you. Any questions?
We can now open the discussion, the debate. 中文也可以。
中文没问题。
Thank you again, Haun, for the pleasure and the amazingly interesting and challenging things you're producing every time. There is, from the text that you quoted, the one from the Shuoyuan seems to me particularly of interest right now. Mostly because in comparison to all the others, it seems to be the only one actually reproducing texts, long text, in a different language, it seems.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, the Bailang song is preserved, but only in the commentary to the Hohan Shu. So the main text only gives the Chinese text, but then in a nearly contemporary commentary, you get the copied Bailang song in phonetic transcription that came from the Dongguanji.
That was actually my question, basically. If we can think of the larger process of everything you have just mentioned as a kind of oneization, if you would, translating the zhi from whatever substantial characteristics it has into one, and giving obviously literary sounding forms to all these songs. It seems that the actual reproduction, phonetic reproduction, is not common. Do we have other examples? How often does it happen? In what sense does this change perhaps the relationing to the other at large? Is there a wholly other represented only through a kind of phonetic approximation that exists just like this?
Right.
Text side.
Yeah.
And similar differences between the wholly other and the other we know and we refer to as the Sufang or whatever.
Right, yeah. Phonetic equivalences we find in Chinese in really specialized contexts, right? Names, right? Although it's also the case that after generations of Sinicization, many people who came into the world with names like, Aluobenda, then take a name of Han origin, and they say, okay, my family name from now on is going to be Zheng, and it simplified life for them a lot, I'm sure. But so you find, personal names, place names, that kind of thing. Very rarely you might have a word or two transliterated, right, but not connected text. The exception, of course, is in the immense textual universe of Buddhism, where lots and lots of Sanskrit terms are transliterated, and this is done systematically enough that if we didn't have documents in Sanskrit, we could probably reconstruct the Sanskrit pronunciations of things. It's not hard to correlate. And and in many cases, in fact, where the Sanskrit text of a sutra has been lost and we only have the Chinese version, we can reconstitute it. And there's not a lot of loose arbitrariness in that, right? So they really were attentive to the foreign and preserved it where necessary. They developed a lot of local semantic equivalents for things, right? But just depending on situation and context, I guess they made the choice. But also because the Buddhist Translation Initiative was an institutionalized kind of thing, right? They were very systematic, and they were always comparing every new translation with the other ones to make sure that they harmonized. So that's the other realm where it happens. But again, Buddhist textuality is a little bit outside of literary textuality, and very outside of the textuality of most, say, Chinese philosophy or ethical discourse or, exam writing. Forget about it, right? There's a story, I think, in Mingru Xuan about a guy who presents himself for the exam and says, Confucius says this, and Shakyamuni says that, and the examiners were just purple in the face and kicked him out, and there was a big scandal. You don't talk about Buddhism at the exams. That's not what that's for, right? So anyway, there are some very real boundaries there, and so that kind of foreignizing translation practice was kept safely behind the fence of the Buddhist community. So anyway, there's just not a whole lot of it, although if you look for it, you begin to notice it,
So basically, the barbarians sing, but only in Chinese, or mostly in Chinese.
Well, the language that's used tends to transform the content, And in fact, one analogy, again, an imperfect analogy, but Kevin is giving me courage to use this kind of bold analogy. You think about medieval Latin versus Renaissance Latin. Medieval Latin is extremely wild and shaggy. People invent words all the time. They have weird constructions. But after Erasmus comes along and, Poggio Bracciolini and all these classicizing people who say, no, we must write like Tacitus and Cicero. Everybody cleans up their act, and the number of things that you can say in Latin is greatly reduced, right? So the weirdo Latin of people like Duns Scotus, it becomes a curiosity. Nobody reads that anymore. Or the alchemists, they're doing all kinds of things with language that you can't do in Ciceronian language. And so a person coming along in the Latin world of 1600, might think that there's all this stuff that you simply can't say. There's no word for it in Latin because the time when there was a word for it had gone by. So something like that is happening, I think, with literary Chinese.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Su and Professor Zhang. I have a question is about the page 4. You have a pattern about Zhou Li, Si Yi Yue, and you use the word mandala. So it's interesting because you use the word of mandala, and this called like Si Fang or similar like Wu Fu. So
Right.
different way of the cosmology. So is this a possibility? I mean, this combined the two cosmology. Maybe in the ancient China, especially when you mention about the civilization or Confucianization or the Hanhua, Luhua, or maybe another word is Hindu Fanhua. Fanhua. Yeah. And my question is more like novel analysis about the under the practices of the civilization. Maybe.
Yeah. I guess mandala was a little bit inappropriate because it's an Indian term, but it was just to say that it's a kind of a pattern, right? It's a meaningful a map of ideas that's projected onto space. Exactly what the Mingtang does. If you read the Mingtang Wei chapter of Li Ji, it's all about arranging everything so that space and time become the same thing, and by moving through the palace, you're moving through the calendar of the year, and so on. So, that's a gesture of a very powerful systematization, right? And it's claiming also the authority of nature, right? Because the 4 seasons, this is stuff that we're all subject to. One of the things that distinguishes the Yi, if you remember, is that they don't follow the calendar, right? So they simply, when it gets warm or when the birds begin to hatch, they say, "Oh, it must be spring," right? But they don't have a calendar that says, "All right, it's 28 days since Li Chun, so it should be getting warm," right? So anyway, and so this kind of mandala is a way of harnessing the power of nature to set time and space and make it all revolve around the Zhou Tianzi. And this map, by the way, comes from Yu Xiaohua, this musical historian whose essay is something that I was very inspired by. Yeah.
The second question is about the you mentioned about the Tu Yuhun and Tu Yuhun and Dong Huang, and they are not emphasized by maybe more about the Mongol, Tibet, or India, especially. So, is there another hierarchy system? Maybe another hierarchy system. About this is Huaxia and Huayi difference, but the other maybe another hierarchy systems that they two. And another day, Tu Yuhun is interesting because now in Qinghai policy, there is a Tuzu, and they are challenge each other because they are too hard. One say, okay, I'm the Tu Yuhun's 后代, another said, oh, I'm the Mongolians. They are competition each other. So nowadays in Qinghai Tuzu, they have too hard, especially the minority individuals. They are fighting still nowadays. So.
Yeah. Oh, that is fascinating. Yeah. Of course, there were lots of hierarchies that were invisible to Chinese. Among the Mongols, right, the descendants of Genghis Khan, of Genghis Khan, were superior to the others, right? You had the Chinggisids, who always had the positions of authority, and then the Oirats and the others were forced to move away, right? They had to ride west, kind of like Agan in that song, and I imagine that for somebody who wasn't familiar with those lineage stories, none of this would have made very much sense, right? And yet that was a very important fact of life for people in the Yuan dynasty, right? Which which kind of lineage you belong to, and what opportunities would arise for you. But that is fascinating about the Tuyuhun still competing. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
This is actually not a question. Can I respond to the previous question raised by you?
Sure.
I think the picture will look quite different if we take into account how some non-Han local people used the Chinese Hanzi writing system to record their songs, their sounds. Okay. For example, I came across this special collection of songs by a group of Han Chinese scholars. But their source, they relied on a series of texts, a series of song books compiled by the Southwest Zhuang people.
Right.
And
Yeah.
we know that the Zhuang people actually have their own writing system called the Zhuangzi. And the Zhuangzi is a variation of the Hanzi. So it's hard to say, you see. Many of the songs are transliterations using, the Chinese characters in variation to record the local sounds, to record the Zhuang sounds. And sometimes they have to invent new characters. That's how the Zhuangzi works. So if we take that part into account, we'll have a quite different picture. Right? So probably you will find that interesting. And also for Han, I'm so glad I made a special trip from Academia Sinica to come here.
I'm glad you did too.
I realized that we have some common interest.
Yeah.
Can I have one question? Because this question actually puzzled myself.
Yeah.
This is also on page 14, where you cite the first of the three songs
Right.
by the also Southwest people, right?
Yeah.
And as you just explained, when Dongguan Hanji recorded this event and the songs, the Dongguan Hanji actually offered the transliteration,
Right. Yeah.
But in Hou Han Shu, it's deleted.
Yeah.
The transliteration part is deleted. We only get the translation. However, in the Tang Dynasty, under Prince Li Xian's guidance, I think, his leadership, they somehow put the transliteration back.
Oh, aha.
Right?
Great.
So
Yeah.
I wonder, does this have anything to do with how people in different historical periods view the question? How sound matter?
Yeah.
Does the singing actually matter? Does the differences in different languages matter?
Right.
I do not have any answer. I keep wondering, so I wonder if you can enlighten me.
Yeah.
Have you?
Sure. Well, I think literati culture was just not very friendly to these foreign sounds, right? They looked exotic and nonsensical, and so it's exactly the kind of thing that you would expect from a 正史, right? From one of the official histories to drop or make secondary the foreign sound, except that in a period when the national boundaries are more porous, then foreign sounds are interesting, and it might be worthwhile to keep that original. I have a parallel case from Korea, right? Because everybody knows the Koreans used Hanzi for many centuries, and in the 1400s, King Sejong invented the Korean alphabet. And some of the literati in Korea were very skeptical of this, and they said, we shouldn't use this Korean alphabet. They said, the people who use alphabets of their own are the Mongols, the Manchus, the Uyghurs. This is not the company we want to keep. We really are, the true inheritors of the Zhongguo, and we can remain the inheritors of the Zhongguo only if we don't use this phonetic script. Right? So there's clearly a hierarchy of scripts in the minds of those literati, but of course, the people of Korea were not 100% on the side of the literati, and by now, Hanzi are kind of obsolete in Korea, except for extremely educated people. But that's, there seems to be kind of a consistent literati interest that tends to repress exactly the kind of thing that you and I seem to be most interested in recovering and putting in the light. So we have a very heavy rock to lift if we're going to excavate all these things.
And what Xiaowen said about the borrowing of scripts also happened in Japan
and in Korea, even before they completely accepted the Chinese writing. So the earliest extant Japanese text called Kojiki is known to be supposedly transliteration of the oral Japanese in Chinese characters.
It's a combination, actually.
Exactly, but at least what you said actually also took place in Japan.
Yeah.
Likewise in Korea.
Time is almost over. I don't know if there is some last question.
I think there is.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I'm curious about what you think about, do we have to distinguish different kinds of barbarians? Because in today's talk, there seems to be the type of barbarians that's more looked down, like their sound or their music is translated, but maybe during the process, like deliberately, just meaning is being changed. But if we think of the transmission of Buddhism into China, then there is Chang, there's Buddhist songs, for rituals, there's chants. And as you mentioned earlier, that it's not the cultural communication has to go both ways, right? So China, in fact, actually takes in a lot of barbarian cultures, right?
Yeah.
And it's not only a Hanzi. I remember there are some Buddhist texts. There is transliteration just because they think, and it's closer to the original, and there is a sacred meaning in this religious text. So I'm just wondering, what do you think about this? And if we put that aspect of barbarian culture to challenge what the sign, like central, like Chinese sort of view, what kind of outlook do we have? And the other question is just for fun. I'm just curious. So to challenge this Sinization tendency, usually we say to understand a culture, we study the canon or the literary text, right? So it seems like maybe we need a new course or a new group of texts. Like when I was a student, we studied from like 5 classics, right? All this Confucian text, and so that's kind of related to our idea of what Chinese literature, what Chinese culture is. So for this project, if you are to conceive some text, so that we can have a new idea of looking at Chineseness or non-Chineseness, the multiple cultures in it. What are the texts you have in mind, or what's the directions that you have in mind?
Yeah. Well, let's see. I'm unveiling some of the things that I'll be bringing out in the next couple of lectures, but no reason not to. For one thing about the Buddhists, there's there are a lot of words that are called zhou in Chinese, right, or dharani in Sanskrit, right, magic formulas. And of course, for them to be effective, you have to say them, in the original or in a conventional form of the original. And that's a particular school of thought within Buddhism, and that was one of the earliest ceremonial forms to be brought over, right? So that's a whole fascinating thing to follow. And of course, in music, the Tang court had Tianzhu Yinyue, and of course, even in the titles of Ci, like Pu Sa Man and so on, Xin Yu San Hua. I mean, there's heavy Buddhist influence in all of those, and probably there were tunes imported from India. So they're examples of something that's put in honor. But who was it who institutionalized Buddhism and brought it into the court? It certainly wasn't the Han Dynasty, right? Despite Han Mingdi's reported dream, it was the Beiwei, right? It was the Liang. It was these semi-barbarous dynasties that maybe needed more forms of legitimation in order to seat their power firmly, right? So they added on Buddhist political theory to their traditional Chinese behaviors. But about a canon, yeah. So I think one experiment might be to treat. This is what I've been doing this week anyway, just reading nothing but Yuefu Shiji and just reading it through and looking for the exotic notes that are struck quite often, right? And thinking, okay, what if Yuefu Shiji was the central text that we all studied? I mean, it doesn't have to be Yuefu Shiji, right? It could also be, I don't know, Yu Tai Xinyong or something, but one of these other texts that is familiar in a way, but that's always put in a particular category, right? You say, oh yeah, that's Yuefu poetry, that's just that specific genre, and there are so many things about it that make Yuefu Shiji contents not very much like, say, the kind of thing that would be collected in Tangshi Sanbai Shou, right? The very canonical sort of stuff. And likewise, more eccentric writing that was hard for people to accept at the time of its original composition. Eccentric stuff. I always love the eccentrics because when you read an eccentric, you get the orthodox version of things that the eccentric is rebelling against, and the eccentric's version of things. It's kind of always a counterpoint. Whereas if you only read the orthodox stuff, you have no idea what the eccentric would be doing, right? So, I can imagine a classical Chinese literary canon that would go looking for all these things that are traditionally marginal or weird, and would put them in the center, and then we'd see what happens, right? That would be a recommendation. Yeah.
If I may follow on
Han's point, Buddhism has a special place in this one-sided standardization, in the sense that it has holy or sacred power that doesn't depend on Confucianism.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Saussy. Thank you for your time. Thank you all for your questions and discussion. So we'll meet next Tuesday at 4 p.m. So thank you very much.